I never thought I'd be the kind of person who gets turned away from her own granddaughter's wedding. And not for anything cruel, or scandalous, or inappropriate. No, they said it was because I didn't fit the aesthetic. That's the word they used. Aesthetic. Like I was a mismatched chair in a carefully curated dining room. Not a person. Not family. Just something that didn't quite go with the decor. Can you imagine? 90 years old, and somehow still too much for some people to look at. It was a soft, cloudy afternoon, the kind where everything feels a little faded. I had pressed my emerald green suit the night before, the one with the satin collar and the gold button that used to belong to my mother. I'd even taken out my little pearl earrings, not the fancy kind, just enough to sparkle when I turned my head. My granddaughter Lily had always loved those earrings when she was little. Used to tug on them when I held her. I wore them for her. Thought maybe she'd smile and say something. But when I stepped out of the car and into that gravel courtyard, the air shifted. You know that feeling? Like when you walk into a room and suddenly everyone remembers they left the stove on. There was a woman, not family, some kind of event planner I suppose, who came rushing toward me with that brittle smile people wear when they're about to say something unkind but don't want you to get mad about it. She touched my elbow gently, like I might break, and whispered, "Would you mind waiting just a moment?" And then she led me to a side bench, under the pretense of getting me a drink. I waited there for 25 minutes. No drink. Just me, the creaking of the bench, and the soft hush of laughter from behind the barn doors. Eventually, Lily's mother came out, my daughter, with a look on her face I hadn't seen since she was 13 and got caught sneaking out to a party. Shame and defiance all twisted up together. She didn't sit. Just leaned forward slightly and said, "Mom, the photographer says it might be better if, maybe you watch the ceremony from the back. It's just, your outfit kind of stands out and we're doing this really clean look. Boho neutrals. You know." No. I didn't know. What I did know was that I wasn't welcome. Not really. Not in the way that matters. I nodded like a fool and said, "Of course, sweetheart." And I smiled. I always smile when I'm being dismissed. A little tick I picked up raising 3 children and nursing a husband who never once asked if I was tired. That smile, it's not kindness. It's armor. They let me sit in the back. Behind the ferns. I couldn't see much. Just Lily's silhouette when she turned toward the groom. She was radiant. And I wept. Not because I was proud. Not because I was touched. I wept because I realized in that moment that I didn't know her anymore. Or maybe she never really knew me. Either way, I was a stranger at her wedding. On the ride home, driven by the neighbor boy, since they didn't even think to arrange a car, I kept fiddling with that gold button on my lapel. Round and warm in my fingers. My mother wore that button on the coat she marched in during the protests in '62. She called it her dignity button. Said it reminded her she deserved to be seen. Funny, I always thought it was a silly little thing. But sitting in the back seat, tears drying on my cheeks, I realized, she was right. That button meant something. And I had worn it to be seen. And still, I had disappeared. I didn't say anything that night. Just climbed the stairs to my apartment, poured a glass of sherry, and sat in the quiet with my aching knees and full heart. I thought about every wedding I helped plan, every birthday cake I baked, every sleepover I hosted so the kids could have time to themselves. I thought about the sacrifices, the silences, the small decisions that turned into an entire life of putting others first. And I asked myself, for what? So I could be hidden behind the ferns? The next morning, I got a text from Lily. Short and sweet. "Hope you understand, Nana. We were going for a curated aesthetic. Love you." No apology. Just that word again. Aesthetic. I looked it up. Concerned with beauty or the appreciation of beauty. Apparently, I wasn't beautiful enough to be seen at my own granddaughter's wedding. That sentence sat in my chest like wet wool. Heavy. Damp. Impossible to shake off. I didn't respond. What could I say? Thank you for reminding me I'm invisible. So glad my decades of love and labor couldn't compete with your Pinterest board? No. I just stared at the message, then deleted it. And for the first time in my life, I didn't smile when someone hurt me. I just sat with it. Let it ache. Let it fester. I needed to feel the betrayal, fully, or I'd never be able to rise above it. Later that week, I found myself pulling out an old photo album. Not the digital kind. The kind with thick pages and corner stickers peeling off. There was a photo of me in '58, standing outside the jazz club in New Orleans where I used to sing. I wore red lipstick, a white coat with fur trim, and a look in my eye that said I know exactly who I am. I ran my finger across the edge of that photo and whispered to her, "That girl, I miss you." And that's when it hit me. I hadn't lost Lily that day. I'd lost me, over the years, one tiny compromise at a time. I'd become so good at shrinking, I didn't even realize I was small. They didn't erase me. I gave them the pen. I went to bed that night with my heart pounding. Not in sadness, but in awakening. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about the 1,000 other moments that came before it. When I skipped vacations to babysit. When I bit my tongue so my daughter wouldn't feel judged. When I said yes to things that made me feel like a ghost in my own home. This wasn't new. It was just the loudest version of an old song. So I made a decision. Quiet. Fierce. Unapologetic. I would not spend the last chapters of my life asking to be included in a story I helped write. I would not dress in beige to make others more comfortable. I would not apologize for existing in color, in memory, in full. And most of all, I would not let the word aesthetic define my worth. Because I am not decor. I am not a theme. I am a woman who has lived, loved, endured, created, and survived. And I will no longer sit behind the ferns. Not in weddings. Not in life. Let them curate their perfection. I'll be over here, vivid and real. And for the first time in a long while, that's more than enough. Let me tell you about the choices I made. Not the big, sweeping ones that people write about in biographies or newspaper columns. I mean the quiet choices. The kind you repeat so often they stop feeling like choices at all. Like putting the kettle on instead of finishing your painting. Saying, "Don't worry about it, I've got it," when your bones ache and your eyes sting. Skipping the new coat because the kids need shoes. Giving your weekend away to babysit, again, even though you'd planned to go listen to jazz at the park. I made a life out of those choices. And for a while, I thought that was love. That was loyalty. That was what good mothers, good wives, good grandmothers did. But when you give long enough without asking for anything in return, you start to forget you have needs of your own. My relationship with Lily didn't begin at her wedding. It began in a quiet hospital room when she was just minutes old. Her mother was groggy from the anesthesia, and they handed her to me first. Her little eyes were shut tight, her hands curled into perfect fists. I remember thinking, she's going to be a fighter. And I was right, just not in the way I'd hoped. From the beginning, I loved her fiercely. The kind of love that makes you hold back your opinions, that makes you smile when they roll their eyes at you, that makes you show up even when you're not invited. I raised her like a third daughter. When her parents were busy with work, it was me who picked her up from school, who read her bedtime stories, who patched her costumes for the school play. I taught her how to sew a button, how to make a decent omelet, how to tell the truth kindly. I thought she remembered those things. I really did. Before I became everyone's caretaker, I used to be someone else entirely. I was Gloria with the red nails and the loud laugh. I used to sing in clubs, you know, jazz, mostly. Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, the kind of music that fills a room and wraps around your bones. People used to say I had a voice that could make you feel drunk without a drop of alcohol. I wore heels I couldn't walk in and lipstick that stained every glass I touched. I was proud. Maybe too proud. But it felt good. I felt alive. And then I met Robert. He was kind. Steady. A good man, if not a passionate one. He wanted a quiet life. I thought I could still have mine inside of his. So I put my microphone away, tucked my records into the attic, and became Mrs. Gloria Whitaker. That was the first disappearing act I ever pulled. The first time I noticed something wasn't right with Lily, it was subtle. A shift in tone, a missed call. I brushed it off. She was busy. Young people are always busy. But then came the wedding invitations that mentioned everyone's name but mine. Group photos I wasn't in, brunches I wasn't invited to. And the comments, little jabs wrapped in lace. That outfit is so bold, Nana. You don't need to fuss with makeup at your age. Maybe just something more simple next time. Each one landed soft, like feathers, but over time, they built a weight that I couldn't ignore. And I kept adjusting. Smiling. Folding myself smaller and smaller to fit into the spaces they left for me. Until eventually, there were no spaces at all. I remember one Tuesday afternoon, I was helping Lily prep for her bridal shower. I'd brought a silver photo frame from my house, vintage, engraved, the kind of thing you can't buy anymore. I thought it might be nice on the welcome table. She looked at it and laughed, said, "It's a bit heavy, don't you think? We're going for something light and airy." And I stood there, holding it, nodding like I agreed. But inside, something cracked. That frame had been a wedding gift to me in 1956. I'd kept it in pristine condition for 64 years. But in that moment, it was just heavy. I put it back in my bag, quietly. She didn't even notice. Or if she did, she didn't care. Looking back, I can see that I was never really allowed to be me once I became theirs. My children needed a stable home, so I gave it. My husband needed a soft place to land, so I became it. My grandchildren needed unconditional love, so I poured it out like a pitcher that never ran dry. But I was never asked what I needed. And the truth is, I didn't know how to ask. I thought love meant not asking. I thought strength meant silence. I thought dignity meant sacrifice. And I was wrong about all of it. There were moments, little ones, that should have warned me. Like the time I bought a bright orange coat and my daughter said, "Mom, that's not really age appropriate." Or the time Lily posted family photos and cropped me out. I told myself I was being sensitive. But now I know, those were clues. They were telling me, in their own quiet ways, that I only belonged if I behaved. If I didn't ruffle feathers. If I kept to the background and smiled for the camera. The saddest part? I started to believe them. I stopped wearing color. I stopped singing in the shower. I even started muting myself at dinner, only speaking when spoken to. I became a ghost, visible, but not seen. Present, but not felt. And I told myself it was normal. That this was just the way of things. But it isn't. It never was. When I think of all the hours I spent stitching hems, peeling potatoes, biting my tongue, it doesn't make me bitter. It makes me tired. Exhausted, really. Because none of it bought me a seat at the table when it mattered. None of it saved me from the humiliation of being asked to sit in the back. None of it protected me from becoming an inconvenience in my own story. But I want to be clear. I'm not angry because they didn't love me the way I loved them. I'm heartbroken because they didn't even see the love I gave. They saw a role. A function. A warm body that filled in the gaps. They saw Nana, not Gloria. Not the woman who sang under the stars and danced barefoot in her living room and read poetry out loud to herself just to feel something real. They loved the idea of me. But they never bothered to know the reality. That realization didn't come all at once. It came in waves. The wedding was just the tide pulling back and showing me how empty the shore really was. But the signs had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to look. What hurts the most is not being uninvited. It's knowing I made myself small for people who never once asked me to be big. Knowing I dulled my light so theirs could shine, only to be told I was too dull to be in the picture. It's a kind of pain that doesn't scream, it simmers. It waits in the bones. It wakes you up at 3 a.m, not with tears, but with silence. And yet, in that silence, something new is growing. Because when you've given everything away and find yourself empty, that's when you finally get to ask, what do I want to fill this space with? And that, my dear, is where the real story begins. I never thought a word like disruptive could feel like a blade. But there it was, slicing through me while I stood in the hallway outside the reception hall, clutching my shawl like it might protect me from the truth. The groom's mother, someone I barely knew, someone who'd smiled at me with that same brittle kindness as the event planner, had said it to another guest. The older woman in green? She's a bit, visually disruptive. As if I were some unfortunate design flaw they hadn't foreseen. Not a person. Not a grandmother. Just an aesthetic mistake. It wasn't just what she said, it was how easily it came out of her mouth. Like she had no idea what those words meant to someone like me. Someone who had spent decades folding herself into corners so others could shine. Someone who had given up music, given up color, given up the right to be seen clearly in exchange for being useful. And now, even that wasn't enough. Now, I was too much and not enough all at once. Disruptive. That word echoed in my head like a funeral bell. I don't know what made me stay and listen. Maybe it was the way her voice dipped into something mocking, or maybe I just needed to hear how little I mattered spoken out loud. Either way, I heard it. Every syllable. And then my knees gave way. I had to sit down right there on the cold tile floor. My whole body felt heavy, like I'd swallowed cement and it settled deep in my chest. I couldn't breathe for a second. Or maybe I could, I just didn't want to. Because breathing meant staying in this version of reality where I wasn't loved enough to be seen clearly. Where I was too much, but never quite enough. I remember sitting there, the heels of my hands pressing into the cool tile, trying to steady myself. Trying to make sense of how I got here. How did I become the kind of person who hears cruelty dressed up as taste and just nods along like it makes sense? When did I start accepting other people's definitions of who I should be? That night, I stayed in the hotel room they'd booked for me. Not because I wanted to, but because no one came looking for me. No knock on the door. No call. No text. I sat by the window and watched the streetlights blur together in the rain-slick glass. That's when I finally admitted it to myself, they didn't want me there. Not as I am. Not as Gloria. They wanted me quiet. They wanted me small. They wanted me tucked away behind the ferns so their perfect day wouldn't be ruined by the sight of a woman who refused to disappear entirely. And yet, even as I sat there alone, my mind betrayed me with a memory I hadn't summoned in years. Lily, age 9, wrapped in my old scarves, spinning around the living room like a queen in exile, begging me to tell her about my wild days. She used to say that word like it was magic, wild. Like she couldn't believe that someone like me had ever been anything other than soft-spoken and sweet-smiling. I told her stories, of course. Watered-down ones, anyway. About singing in clubs, about dancing barefoot under string lights, about men who asked me to marry them after 3 songs. And she listened with wide eyes, hanging on every word like I was some kind of legend. Back then, she wanted to be just like me. But now? Now she would rather erase me than let me exist in color. In memory. In full. And that betrayal hurt more than any fall from grace ever could. Because it wasn't just about the wedding, it was about everything that led up to it. All the ways I tried to be what they needed. All the times I folded myself smaller and quieter and softer, thinking that love required silence. Thinking that being useful meant being invisible. I gave and gave and gave, and still, I wasn't enough. Still, I was too much. I think that's the cruelest part of all. To give until you have nothing left, only to find yourself unwelcome in your own life. You stop asking for things, not because you don't need them, but because you're afraid of being seen as greedy, or ungrateful, or worse, inconvenient. So you learn to take up less space. You learn to wear beige instead of emerald green. You learn to laugh quietly, speak softly, walk lightly. You learn to apologize for needing a chair, for taking up a seat, for existing at all. And then someone calls you disruptive. That's when the mask slips. That's when you realize you've been pretending so long, you forgot you were wearing it. I sat there in the dark for hours, replaying the whole day in my head. The car ride. The bench. The photographer. The ferns. The toast they probably made without mentioning me. I imagined Lily smiling, radiant in her dress, surrounded by people who adored her. And I wept. Not because I was proud. Not because I was touched. I wept because I realized in that moment that I didn't know her anymore. Or maybe she never really knew me. Either way, I was a stranger at her wedding. And then I thought about my mother. About that gold button on my lapel, the one she called her dignity button. I remembered the way she used to pin it on before protests, before court hearings, before standing up to landlords who tried to push us out. She believed in being seen. Believed that sometimes, just showing up was an act of resistance. And I wore that button to be seen. And still, I disappeared. Why didn't anyone see me? Why didn't anyone care? Why didn't anyone ask? On the ride home, driven by the neighbor boy, since they didn't even think to arrange a car, I kept fiddling with that gold button on my lapel. Round and warm in my fingers. My mother wore that button on the coat she marched in during the protests in '62. She called it her dignity button. Said it reminded her she deserved to be seen. Funny, I always thought it was a silly little thing. But sitting in the back seat, tears drying on my cheeks, I realized, she was right. That button meant something. And I had worn it to be seen. And still, I had disappeared. I didn't say anything that night. Just climbed the stairs to my apartment, poured a glass of sherry, and sat in the quiet with my aching knees and full heart. I thought about every wedding I helped plan, every birthday cake I baked, every sleepover I hosted so the kids could have time to themselves. I thought about the sacrifices, the silences, the small decisions that turned into an entire life of putting others first. And I asked myself, for what? So I could be hidden behind the ferns? The next morning, I got a text from Lily. Short and sweet. Hope you understand, Nana. We were going for a curated aesthetic. Love you. No apology. Just that word again. Aesthetic. I looked it up. Concerned with beauty or the appreciation of beauty. Apparently, I wasn't beautiful enough to be seen at my own granddaughter's wedding. That sentence sat in my chest like wet wool. Heavy. Damp. Impossible to shake off. I didn't respond. What could I say? Thank you for reminding me I'm invisible. So glad my decades of love and labor couldn't compete with your Pinterest board? No. I just stared at the message, then deleted it. And for the first time in my life, I didn't smile when someone hurt me. I just sat with it. Let it ache. Let it fester. I needed to feel the betrayal, fully, or I'd never be able to rise above it. Later that week, I found myself pulling out an old photo album. Not the digital kind. The kind with thick pages and corner stickers peeling off. There was a photo of me in '58, standing outside the jazz club in New Orleans where I used to sing. I wore red lipstick, a white coat with fur trim, and a look in my eye that said I know exactly who I am. I ran my finger across the edge of that photo and whispered to her, "That girl, I miss you." And that's when it hit me. I hadn't lost Lily that day. I'd lost me, over the years, one tiny compromise at a time. I'd become so good at shrinking, I didn't even realize I was small. They didn't erase me. I gave them the pen. I went to bed that night with my heart pounding. Not in sadness, but in awakening. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about the 1,000 other moments that came before it. When I skipped vacations to babysit. When I bit my tongue so my daughter wouldn't feel judged. When I said yes to things that made me feel like a ghost in my own home. This wasn't new. It was just the loudest version of an old song. So I made a decision. Quiet. Fierce. Unapologetic. I would not spend the last chapters of my life asking to be included in a story I helped write. I would not dress in beige to make others more comfortable. I would not apologize for existing in color, in memory, in full. And most of all, I would not let the word aesthetic define my worth. Because I am not decor. I am not a theme. I am a woman who has lived, loved, endured, created, and survived. And I will no longer sit behind the ferns. Not in weddings. Not in life. Let them curate their perfection. I'll be over here, vivid and real. And for the first time in a long while, that's more than enough. The first time I stood up for myself, it was so small you might laugh. I wore red lipstick to brunch. Not the muted rose or soft mauve they say is flattering on mature skin. No, I went full crimson, bold and unapologetic. It felt like a rebellion wrapped in wax paper. I remember staring at myself in the mirror that morning, watching the color settle into place, the way it made my lips feel alive again. My hands were shaking slightly as I blotted them against a tissue, but not from fear, from something else. Something electric. Like maybe, just maybe, this tiny act of defiance was the first real thing I'd done in years. And when I walked into that little cafe, heads turned. Not because I was loud or out of place, but because I looked like someone who remembered herself. I used to wear red all the time. Before motherhood, before marriage, before the world told me how a woman my age should behave. Back then, red meant power. It meant presence. It meant I was here, and I wasn't asking permission to be seen. But over the years, I let it go, slowly, one shade at a time. Soft pinks. Nudes. Beige. The kind of colors that whisper, "Don't worry, I'm not really here." Until one day, I realized I didn't even own anything bold anymore. That realization hit me harder than I expected. Because I hadn't lost the ability to wear red. I had simply convinced myself I no longer deserved to. So when I walked into that cafe with fire on my mouth, it wasn't vanity, it was reclaiming territory. And the best part? Nobody said a word. Not one person asked if I was okay, or suggested I tone it down, or laughed behind their menus. They just saw me. And for once, I didn't shrink under their gaze. That's when I started changing the conversation inside my head. Instead of asking, should I have worn this? Or do I look too much? I began telling myself things I hadn't dared say aloud in decades. You're not outdated, you're timeless. You're not too much, you're exactly enough. You don't need permission to take up space. Those words weren't just affirmations, they were armor. And every time I repeated them, I felt stronger. More real. Less like a ghost haunting her own life and more like a woman stepping back into it. I caught myself smiling in mirrors again. Not the polite, apologetic smile I gave people when they dismissed me. This one was different. Fuller. Louder. A smile that said, "You may have forgotten me, but I remember who I am." So I started making changes. Small ones at first. Then bigger. I cleared out my closet, throwing away anything beige. All those soft tones that whispered, "Don't draw attention." Gone. Every neutral sweater, every muted blouse, every gray cardigan that made me feel invisible, it all went into boxes for charity. And in their place, I brought color back into my life. Deep blues, rich purples, golds that shimmered in the light. I found an old scarf tucked in the back of a drawer, red and green paisley, frayed at the edges, but still vibrant. I wrapped it around my neck and stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. That girl from New Orleans was in there somewhere. I could see her now. And then came Ava. Lily's younger sister. The one who never quite fit into the same mold as the rest of them. She always had a quiet strength about her. A stubbornness I recognized in myself. We hadn't spoken much since the wedding. Most of the family avoided me after that, but she showed up at my door one afternoon with 2 cups of tea and a look in her eye that said she knew what had happened. We sat on the porch swing, sipping chamomile in silence for a while, until she finally spoke. "You looked fabulous, by the way," she said, almost offhandedly. At first, I thought she meant the outfit. Or maybe the lipstick. But then I realized, she meant everything. She meant the way I held myself. The way I refused to apologize for being seen. The way I was choosing to live differently now. And that moment, small as it was, meant more than any apology ever could. But not everyone was happy about the new me. My daughter, Lily's mother, was the first to push back. "You're being dramatic, Mother," she said during one of our weekly calls. As if standing up for yourself was some kind of performance art. As if wanting to exist in color instead of gray was somehow excessive. I didn't argue. I just listened. Let her speak her piece. And when she was done, I told her, "Maybe I am being dramatic. Maybe I've been underplaying myself for so long, anything that looks like truth must seem theatrical to you." She didn't respond right away. There was a pause, a long one, and then she mumbled something about loving me before ending the call. I hung up and stared at the phone for a while, letting the tension settle. I wasn't angry. Just tired. Tired of being asked to stay small for people who never learned how to see me in the first place. Still, I kept going. I joined a book club. Took a painting class at the community center. Signed up for a jazz appreciation group downtown, of all things. I didn't know if I'd sing again, but I wanted to hear the music that once filled my bones. And when I walked into that room for the first time, clutching my notebook like a teenager at her first concert, I realized something: these people didn't know me. They didn't expect me to be anyone other than who I was in that moment. And that freedom from roles, from expectations, from being Nana, felt like air after years underwater. People started noticing. Neighbors waved. Shop owners smiled. Strangers complimented my style. It was strange how good it felt to be acknowledged without needing to earn it. Without having to serve or sacrifice. I started speaking louder in public. Asking questions instead of nodding along. Making eye contact. Holding doors open for others, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And slowly, the world began to treat me like I mattered, not because I proved it, but because I believed it. Even Ava kept showing up. Not often, but enough. She'd text me random quotes from poems she liked. Bring me books she thought I'd enjoy. Once, she invited me to a concert, live jazz, right downtown. We sat in the front row, shoulder to shoulder, and when the singer hit that final note, she leaned over and whispered, "You used to do this, didn't you?" I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "A long time ago." And for the first time, I didn't feel like that version of me was gone. Just sleeping. Waiting for the right moment to wake up. It hasn't been easy. Change rarely is. Some days, I still catch myself slipping back into old habits. Smiling when I want to speak. Folding my opinions into neat little squares so others won't feel uncomfortable. But then I remember the ferns. The bench. The photographer's request. The text message that read, "Hope you understand." And I remind myself, I don't owe them silence. I don't owe them obedience. I don't owe them anything except the truth that I am still here. Still breathing. Still capable of joy. Of color. Of life. And so I keep moving forward. One step at a time. One red lip at a time. One reclaimed memory at a time. I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. Not to Lily. Not to my daughter. Not to the groom's mother who called me disruptive. I'm doing this for me, for the girl in the photo album, for the woman who sang under string lights, for the grandmother who deserves to be seen not as a function, but as a force. Because I am not decor. I am not a theme. I am not a footnote in someone else's story. I am Gloria. And I am only just beginning. The first thing I did was dye my hair lavender. Not gray, not brown, not even the soft auburn I used to color over the white strands for years. No, lavender. That deep, rich shade that looks like twilight and defiance all mixed together. When I walked into the salon, the stylist looked at me like I'd just announced I was running off to join a circus. But I didn't flinch. I sat down in that chair and said, "Let's do it." And as she worked the dye through my roots, I watched myself in the mirror, waiting to see if I would recognize the woman staring back at me. At first, I didn't. The face was still mine, creases from years of smiling when I didn't feel like it, eyes that had seen too many goodbyes, but the hair? That was something else entirely. That was a declaration. A reclaiming. And when I paid the bill and stepped outside, the wind caught the ends of it and lifted them like wings, I realized I hadn't felt this alive in decades. I remember walking home, passing people on the sidewalk and catching their eyes. Some smiled. Some stared. One man actually stopped me to say, "That's a bold look. You wear it well." I thanked him and kept walking, but inside, I was glowing. For so long, I worried about what others thought, whether I was too much, too loud, too colorful. I spent years shrinking into muted tones, into quiet corners, into roles that left no room for me. But now, with purple strands catching the sunlight, I felt like I was finally stepping into my own skin again. It wasn't just about the hair, it was about showing up as myself, unapologetically, for the first time in what felt like forever. And maybe that sounds silly to some folks. Maybe they'll say, "It's just hair." But sometimes, just hair is enough to remind you who you are when you've forgotten. Still, I knew changing the way I looked wasn't going to fix everything. I had more work to do. And I knew that if I wanted to confront my family, if I wanted to speak the truth without crumbling under the weight of their disappointment, I would need strategy. Not rage. Just truth. I wasn't interested in burning bridges or making accusations. I wasn't here to punish anyone. I was here to set boundaries. To let them know, clearly and calmly, that I would no longer be erased. That I would no longer fold myself into smaller spaces just to make them comfortable. That I would no longer apologize for taking up space. So I started writing. I filled pages with thoughts, memories, feelings I'd buried for years. I listed every time I had been made to feel small, every moment I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. And then I wrote out what I wanted. Not revenge. Not apologies. Just recognition. Just respect. Just the right to exist fully, even if it meant existing differently than before. While I was preparing for that conversation, the one I knew would come, I started going to senior theater workshops. Found an ad for them at the community center, pinned up next to a flyer for yoga and another for chess club. Something about it called to me. I used to love acting when I was younger. Before motherhood, before marriage, before life decided I needed to be serious all the time. So I signed up. Showed up early the first day, expecting a handful of older folks reading scripts off paper plates and pretending to forget their lines. What I found instead were people who lived loud. Who laughed until they cried. Who shouted Shakespeare into the rafters and told stories that made the whole room hold its breath. They weren't there to be cute. They were there to be seen. And suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. We were all there for different reasons, some looking for purpose, some for joy, some just to fill the silence, but we all shared the same hunger, to be real again. To be heard. And in that room, I found a kind of freedom I had almost forgotten existed. One woman, Mabel, took me aside after our second session and said, "You're holding back, Gloria. You don't have to play small just because you're older." Her words stayed with me. They echoed in my head during every rehearsal, every performance, every time I stood in front of the mirror practicing monologues late at night. She was right. I had spent so long playing the part of the quiet grandmother, the helpful mother, the obedient wife, that I forgot how to take up space. But in that workshop, I remembered. I learned how to project my voice. How to walk with confidence. How to stand tall, even when my knees ached. And slowly, those lessons began to bleed into the rest of my life. I spoke louder at the grocery store. I asked for what I wanted at restaurants. I stopped nodding along when people talked over me. I was becoming someone new, and yet, somehow, I was also becoming the person I had always been, just hidden beneath layers of expectation. For the first time in decades, I did something just for me. I got my ears re-pierced. Yes, I know. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But hear me out. My ears had been closed for years. After Robert died, I stopped wearing earrings altogether. Said I didn't want to bother with them. Said I didn't need anything extra. But really, it was easier to disappear without them. Without the sparkle. Without the little reminders that I once loved being noticed. So when I walked into that piercing shop, heart pounding like I was committing a crime, I told myself it was just jewelry. Just metal. Just decoration. But when the piercer handed me the mirror afterward and I saw the tiny silver hoops glinting against my lavender hair, I realized it was more than that. It was proof. Proof that I could still change. Still choose. Still decide what I wanted, regardless of what anyone else thought. And that, my dear, is a powerful thing. I could feel the confrontation coming, like a summer storm just before the sky breaks open. I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I knew what I wanted to say. I had practiced it in my head, rehearsed it in the mirror, written it down in letters that trembled slightly with emotion. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to tell them the truth. That I had given everything. That I had loved fiercely. That I had tried so hard to fit into the version of me they expected, only to realize that version never truly existed. I was more than the role they assigned me. More than the background figure. More than the woman behind the ferns. And I deserved to be seen, not as a function, not as decor, not as a theme, but as a full, flawed, radiant human being. And if they couldn't accept that, then I would live with that pain. Because I had already lived with worse. I had lived with invisibility. And I refused to go back. So I waited. Patiently. Let them reach out first. Let them ask why I hadn't responded to Lily's text. Let them wonder why I wasn't at the next family dinner. And when the call came, my daughter, hesitant, uncertain, I answered. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply said, I'm tired of being invisible. And then I told her everything. About the bench. The photographer. The wedding. The lavender hair. The earrings. The theater. The truth. Every word came out steady, clear, unwavering. And when I finished, there was silence. Long, heavy. Then a sigh. And finally, a whisper. I didn't realize it hurt so much. And that, right there, was the beginning of something new. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. And that was enough, for now. I chose the place carefully, Lily's baby shower. Family everywhere. No escaping this time. I didn't want a quiet moment in the kitchen or a hushed conversation over coffee. No, this needed witnesses. Needed ears and eyes and silence so thick it could be carved. The venue was her living room, decorated with pastel balloons and soft pink streamers that made everything feel like a dream you weren't invited into. There were gifts stacked like offerings on the dining table, little onesies folded neatly beside handmade quilts I hadn't been asked to help with. Everyone was there, my daughter, Lily's husband, cousins who only remembered my name when they needed a favor. I sat near the center of it all, not tucked away, not hidden behind ferns or politely excused to another room. I wore a dress I had picked out weeks ago, a deep plum color with a high collar and a long line that made me feel regal, even if my knees begged for mercy. And I brought something else, a small wireless microphone I had borrowed from the theater group. It wasn't for performance. It was for power. I made sure I wouldn't be talked down to this time. I had the mic literally. When someone holds a microphone, people listen. They lean forward. They lower their voices. They wait. So when I stood up, holding that little black device like it was a sword, the room shifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Laughter faded into an uneasy hush. Even the baby, swaddled in a blanket too big for her tiny frame, stopped fussing. I looked around at them all, my children, my grandchildren, the people who had shaped my life and then quietly reshaped it without asking, and I breathed. Deeply. Fully. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing in my own body, not borrowing space from someone else's story. I cleared my throat and said, before we open presents, I need to say something. That was all. Just those few words. But the weight behind them was enough to bend the air. What I said was simple but took a lifetime to say, I am not a decoration. I am a person. I let it hang there, sharp as glass. No apology. No explanation. Just the truth, raw and unvarnished. And then I kept going. Because once you start telling your truth, it doesn't stop at one sentence. It spills out like wine from a tipped bottle, staining everything it touches. For most of my life, I have been told how to behave, what to wear, where to sit, when to speak. I've been called visually disruptive, asked to move out of photos, told my opinions were outdated, my style too bold, my presence too much. I've smiled through it all. Nodded. Laughed. Shrunk. But I won't do it anymore. My voice never wavered. Not once. Not even when I saw my daughter's face twist into something between discomfort and fear. Not even when Lily's hand went to her belly as though protecting her unborn child from whatever storm she thought I was bringing. I had rehearsed these words. Written them in journals, whispered them to myself in mirrors, spoken them aloud during walks through the park where no one could hear. But hearing them come out in front of everyone, really hearing them, was different. It was like watching a painting finally dry after years of being wet, colors locking into place forever. You raised me to be polite, I continued. To put others first. To smile when I wanted to scream. And I did. I gave everything, my time, my energy, my joy, to make sure you all had what you needed. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. Not because I wanted to. But because I was taught that love meant silence. That strength meant sacrifice. That dignity meant disappearing. A tear slipped free, slow and heavy, but I didn't wipe it away. Let them see it. Let them know that pain doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes, it means honesty. Standing my ground was harder than I expected. Not because I doubted myself, but because I knew how easily they could try to dismiss me. How quickly they might try to change the subject. How fast someone would offer a drink or suggest we talk later. But I had planned for that. I had written it all down. I had printed copies of the letter I'd been working on for months and placed them on every chair. I didn't ask anyone to read it. I just let it be there, proof that this wasn't a tantrum. This was a reckoning. Aesthetic is fleeting, I said, letting the word roll off my tongue like poison. Respect is eternal. That was the heart of it. That was the core of everything I had endured. They wanted me to disappear because I didn't match their vision. But I was not here to fit into their picture. I was here to live my life, fully and fiercely, whether they liked it or not. The look on Lily's face told me everything. Shock. Guilt. Then, admiration. She blinked rapidly, her lips parting slightly like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Her hands rested on her swollen belly, protective, instinctive. And for a moment, I wondered if she was thinking about the kind of mother she would be. If she was realizing that her daughter might grow up seeing her grandmother as more than a background figure. More than a warm body with soft skin and gentle stories. Maybe she was realizing that she had missed out on knowing me, not the version of me that folded herself into corners, but the real one. The one who used to sing under string lights. The one who marched for justice. The one who still has fire in her bones, even if they're older now. My daughter didn't speak right away. She never does. She's always been better at silence than words. But she reached for my hand, slowly, hesitantly, and when our fingers touched, I didn't pull away. That was its own kind of victory. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But recognition. Understanding. A shift in the air that said, we may not be okay, but we are starting to see each other. And then Ava stood up. My granddaughter's younger sister, the one who had started coming to visit again, who had hugged me tighter lately, who had once whispered, I miss the real you. She walked over and wrapped her arms around me, tight and full. That was beautiful, she said, voice thick with emotion. Thank you. And that was when I knew. Not everything would change overnight. Not everyone would suddenly treat me differently. But the tide had turned. The silence was broken. And I had found my voice again. The days after were strange but beautiful. Like waking up in a house that's been cleaned from top to bottom, every window open, letting the sunlight pour through the dustless air. I wasn't sure what to do with myself at first. I had spent so long shrinking into corners and smoothing my edges to fit into spaces that never really wanted me, that I forgot what it felt like to simply be. But now, there was no pretending. No rehearsed smiles. No careful positioning behind the ferns. Just me, standing fully in the light of my own life. And even though the silence left by some absences still echoed sometimes, it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like space. Space for new things. New people. A new version of me. I never knew freedom would feel so much like wearing sequins to the grocery store. That was the first thing I did, pulled out an old dress from the back of the closet, one I hadn't touched in years. It was black, covered in tiny silver sequins that caught the light like stars. I slipped it on, fastened the side zipper with a little struggle, age has its limits, even in rebellion, and stared at myself in the mirror. My hair was lavender now, remember? So there I stood, 68 pounds of defiance wrapped in fabric, earrings catching the light, spine straighter than it had been in decades. And when I walked into the store, heads turned. Not because I was loud or making a scene, but because I was visible. And instead of ducking away from their stares, I smiled. Fully. Freely. Like I had every right to take up space in my own skin. The ones who stayed became my true family. Ava, of course, Lily's younger sister, the only one who ever looked at me like I was more than just a grandmother-shaped figure in the background. She started coming over more often, bringing tea and stories and laughter that made the rooms feel full again. Then there was June, my neighbor across the hall, who had always been kind but now became something more, a friend. We'd sit on the porch swing in the evenings, sipping wine and talking about everything, men we loved, men we regretted, books we read, dreams we still held close. And then there was Marjorie, the dance instructor from the senior center, with purple nails and a laugh that could crack open any silence. She invited me to her classes, not because she thought I needed help moving, but because she saw how much I needed to feel alive again. These women, these unexpected allies, they didn't ask me to shrink. They asked me to shine. Getting rid of that beige shawl felt like shedding skin. You know the one I mean, the soft woolen thing I used to drape around my shoulders like armor. The kind of accessory that says, don't worry, I'm not trying to stand out. I found it folded neatly in a drawer one morning and held it in my hands for a long time. It smelled faintly of lavender sachets and old perfume. I remembered all the times I wore it, brunches where I smiled too much, family photos where I faded into the background, quiet walks where I tried to disappear inside myself. And I realized this shawl wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol of the life I had lived for far too long. One of compromise. Of caution. of waiting to be seen. So I packed it away, along with the other muted clothes, the polite silences, the swallowed words. I didn't throw them out, I donated them. Let someone else wear the past if they needed it. I started introducing myself differently. Not with apologies. Not with titles. Just my name, and a truth that belonged to me alone. I'm Gloria, I'd say, holding out my hand, meeting eyes without hesitation. I used to be fabulous. Now I still am. It became my signature line, the one that let people know I wasn't hiding anymore. I said it at the book club meetings I joined, at the art classes I signed up for, at the poetry readings where I dared to read aloud again. I said it to strangers who asked my name, to shopkeepers who smiled at my earrings, to fellow theater members who clapped when I finished a monologue. And each time I said it, I believed it a little more. Not as vanity. Not as arrogance. But as a reclaiming of something I had nearly lost. There are still days when I feel the pull of the old ways. When I catch myself hesitating before speaking, or wondering if my outfit is too bold, or if my voice might be too much. But now, instead of giving in, I remind myself of the ferns. Of the bench. Of the photographer's request. Of Lily's text message. Of the gold button on my lapel and the woman who once sang under string lights. And then I keep going. I speak anyway. I wear color anyway. I walk tall anyway. Because I have learned that being seen doesn't come from permission, it comes from choice. And I choose to be here. Fully. Unapologetically. Loudly. I've started singing again. Not professionally. Not in clubs. Not even in front of big crowds. Just in the kitchen, while I cook. In the shower, where the acoustics are better than you'd think. At the community center, during our monthly open mic nights, where I recite poems and hum old jazz tunes until the room leans in closer. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the sky is clear, I go out to the garden and sing to the flowers. I don't care if anyone hears me. I just care that I'm doing it. That I'm remembering who I was before I learned how to disappear. That I'm honoring the girl in the photo album, the one with red lipstick and fire in her eyes. And I write. Oh, how I write. Every morning, I sit by the window with my notebook and my pen, and I fill pages with thoughts I used to bury. Letters I'll never send. Poems that ache with truth. Lists of things I want to do before my time runs out, travel to Paris. Learn to play the piano again. Dance barefoot under the moonlight. Publish a book. Live somewhere warm. Fall in love again, maybe. Or just fall in love with myself all over. It doesn't matter which. What matters is that I'm writing my story now. Not the one they wrote for me. Not the one where I fade quietly into the background. This is my story. My words. My rhythm. My song. I still see some of my family. Not often. Not the way I used to. But enough. My daughter calls sometimes. Not always to talk about anything deep, but just to check in. And I appreciate that. I know change takes time. I know undoing decades of expectation isn't easy. But I also know that if they ever want to see me again, not as Nana, not as a role, but as Gloria, they'll have to meet me where I am. Not behind the ferns. Not tucked away. Not muted. But standing tall, dressed in color, unafraid to take up space. Having my real supporters around me that day for my 91st birthday, Ava, June, Marjorie, and a few others who had become more than just friends, was the real celebration. Not because of cake or presents or even the sweet little jazz band Ava hired to play my favorite songs. No, it was because I finally understood what it meant to be surrounded by people who saw me. Not the version of me they wanted, not the grandmother-shaped placeholder in their lives, but the woman who used to sing under string lights and march for justice and laugh until her sides hurt. For the first time in years, I wasn't just tolerated, I was celebrated. And not for being quiet or kind or endlessly giving. But for being Gloria. For the first time, I celebrated my own worth. I toasted to being unaesthetic. Held up a glass of sparkling wine and looked around at the faces smiling back at me, faces that didn't flinch when I wore sequins or talked too loud or tell a story with too many details, and I said, to being too much. And they clinked their glasses without hesitation. They knew exactly what I meant. That word, *aesthetic*, had once been my prison. Now, it was just a silly word that reminded me of how far I'd come. I no longer needed to fit into someone else's vision of beauty. I had built my own. One made of color and courage and a voice that refused to stay silent any longer. My relationship with Lily? It's different now. Realer. She asks me things. Wants to know me, not just as Nana, but as Gloria. The other day, she came over with her daughter in tow, sat on my porch swing, and asked, "Did you really used to sing in clubs?" I almost cried. I told her yes, and then I told her about the jazz scene in New Orleans, about the men who asked me to marry them after 3 songs, about the nights I danced barefoot and laughed until my ribs ached. She listened. Really listened. Her eyes wide like she was hearing a legend. Like she couldn't believe her grandmother had ever been anything other than soft-spoken and sweet-smiling. And maybe she still doesn't fully understand everything we've been through, but she's trying. And sometimes, trying is enough. Standing in that same room where it all started, in the outfit I'd been kicked out in, this time, they clapped. It was Ava's idea. She organized a small gathering at the community center, just for me. Said I deserved to stand tall in front of people who loved me. So I wore the emerald green suit again, the one with the satin collar and the gold button. The one they said was too bold. Too disruptive. Too much. And this time, when I walked in, heads turned. Not with discomfort. Not with dismissal. But with admiration. With joy. With pride. Someone started clapping. Then another. Then the whole room erupted. And I stood there, heart full, knowing I had reclaimed something sacred. My dignity. My presence. My right to exist in color, in memory, in full. If you had told me a year ago that I would reclaim myself at 90, I'd have laughed. Said you were dreaming. That kind of transformation, that kind of freedom, it felt like something for younger women. Something for those who still had time left to undo the damage of a lifetime spent shrinking. But here I am. Still glittering. Still singing. Still learning how to take up space. And I don't regret a single step of the journey. Not the silence. Not the pain. Not the bench behind the ferns. Because it led me back to myself. To the girl in the photo album. To the woman who knows she is more than decor. More than a theme. More than a footnote in someone else's story.